And then you can rely on things like automation and
Yes.
and
To
some of the
anticipate
stuff-
our next segment.
Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about soon to slim down your workforce anymore, which is something Jansen said, I think, at the last earnings call. I mean, he had quite aggressive numbers for how much he thought he could cut.
With the BT bot 1000.
All of a sudden, you've got a company that maybe isn't growing in terms of sales, but its margins have improved dramatically because it's finished this massive infrastructure project. And let's remember, that's a once in 100 years infrastructure project. That's not like putting in new boxes at either end to boost your speeds a bit or putting up some base stations on masts. That's...
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast, your last one for a while, because this weekend I'm pissing off to the Canary Islands for 3 weeks.
Oh, that'll be warm. It's 48 in Sicily at the moment.
48, I mean, that's just silliness. There's no need for that.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, no, it'll be proper hot. I mean, I'm used to it. Half my family live out there. My mum, my brother, sister-in-law, nephews. So we've been going there as a family for decades. And, you know, technically it's better to go into Canaries in the winter, but, you know, summer's when we have the holidays.
Yeah. What is there to do in La Gomera?
Not a lot. I mean, obviously, you see your family. It's great for walking. It's really picturesque. It's really mountainous. Yeah, they're all volcanic islands, the Canary Islands. Yeah, but it's generally a place to chill. You know, you have to fly into Tenerife and then get a ferry over from Los Cristianos, which is a port next to Playa Las Americas, which is where the typical package tourist sort of, you know, lads on tour. I've been out in Las Americas in the evening. It can get pretty rowdy.
I can imagine.
But then La Gomera can be more opposite.
So like Magaluf.
So that sort of Costa del Sol kind of vibe, yeah. Yeah, but then La Gomera's not like that. It hasn't got very many beaches, and you can't fly there, so most people don't bother. So it's a bit of a sort of oasis of calm. Arguably too calm. I actually did live there for a few months, and I got bored shitless.
What are you going to do with yourself?
Well, we're going over there. Actually, it's the first.
He's going to come back obscenely tanned.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just go over there. It's it's just a holiday. It's just chilling, isn't it?
I had the same issue where I'm going, so
Yeah.
what am I going to do with myself here
Right.
for a week and a half?
Right.
I go a week after you, so
Yeah, you just read and just
basically what I do.
unwind, don't you?
yeah.
It's scary. You just said 48 in Sicily, and I'm supposed to be there in 2.5 weeks.
Oh, really? Well, it might have passed by then, the heat wave.
It's
but-
probably 48, like in the middle of it, like in the center.
I mean, the whole of Italy's like above 40 more or less at the moment. Even in the north, I think it's up in the at that level. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And we might get another one of those even in England. Do you remember the 40 degree
That
night
was,
where
that
I
was
just
this
went?
weekend. You know?
Where I just went, I know what, I'm going to keep the windows open, which was the most fucking stupid move.
That was the weekend that's coming up. That was that weekend last year, and it was up at 40.
Oh, right.
The 13th, 14th,
But
whatever.
it's not forecast for anything like that.
No, I don't think July's supposed to be.
It's
going
pretty
above
chilly
30.
right now.
Yeah. Yeah, we won't get, as you were sharing on our little Teams group, we won't be getting those stories going, no, actually, it was quite cold.
It was the
in
mildest July we've had for 20 years.
We only get the stories when it's hot and everyone goes, oh my God,
Yeah.
Greta, save us.
Yeah.
So there's that. And yeah, we got a hard cut off because Pierre and I both got grown up things to do at 4:00. And you just got to sit around or get a head start
Go
in the
and
pub.
edit something that Teresa's written.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
So that's that. What are we going to chat about this week? We're going to talk. Well, actually, we've got two reasons to talk about BT. One that we can't really talk about in much detail, but they took us out for dinner last night, and even Pierre got an invite.
Shout
Bless
out to, I think, Katie Wilson, Alex Jackman, and Richard Fogg.
Yeah,
Richard Fogg, by the way, he's an ultra marathon runner. I didn't know.
I know.
yeah.
That's
What a-
mad, isn't it? Didn't he just run 100 kilometres?
Yeah.
Insane.
Yeah. Well done, Richard. Even though you're mental.
Yeah, that is crazy.
And actually, when I was coming home last night, Richard and I were chatting about a friend of the pod, Mary Clark, and I gave her a ring, and I'll give you another shout out, Mary. We're all thinking of you. Cheers.
I was just thinking about when you said, Charles in town.
Yeah, do my shitty Mary Clark impression. Hi, Scott. So we're going to talk about that, but also because the big news of the week, which is just pure coincidence, because this BT thing had been in the diary for ages, is that their CEO's calling it a day. And so obviously I mean, that's something that we all wanted to talk about, but we weren't going to get much. We weren't going to get much change out of BT on that. Partly because no one's got a Scooby. The next one's going to be anyway.
Well, it was.
But we can
those are the
speculate
two
about
things
that.
I didn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
There were that and the Vodafone 3 merger.
Oh, that was the other one. Yeah, I didn't hear the other thing that they didn't want to talk about. So we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
And then we're going to you and I came to an event in this very building in Informa Towers, run by Omdia, which is also an Informa company, but an analyst firm, and they were talking about AI. I never got around to reading your write-up, but you saw my write-up, but it was quite brief. It was just like, pros, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats of AI sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which just lends itself to endless discussion about dystopian this, that and the other. In fact, remember when we bring up something I was just reading on The Spectator on the way up as well.
On AI?
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't read that yet.
There was a guy who's quite a doom monger about it, and it's worth just extracting one or two quotes from what he was talking about. And then we might, if we warm to that dystopian theme, there's a third one. Something was written up by Nick for us this week, talking about a European digital ID scheme that Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica, and Vodafone in Germany are all field testing. And that's interesting by itself, but then digital ID. It does lend itself to all sorts of possible you can extrapolate it in lots of dystopian directions if you're that way inclined, which I am.
Sounds a bit Margaret Atwood to me.
You know what I mean?
Tale.
Yeah, and social credit.
It's
and
like
all
making people pay with their cards instead of cash.
Well, quite. I mean, I noticed I think the pub we went at, we went out for just one or two after the meal, and I noticed that it was like all these pubs. Or was it the pub we met at beforehand when we met Ray? There was a sign going, "This is a cashless." Increasingly, you see that now. Yeah, it's mad.
They never stand for it in the home counties,
right,
where old people live. They go, "Well, we're not coming here then." My dad, this is a bit of a tangent now, but my dad actually wrote a letter to the pub because they put their beer price up by 50p a pint, complaining about it, and they lowered the price.
Wow.
They brought it back down again. He said, if you do this, you'll lose customers because I won't be there anymore, and all the people I know in the village will boycott your pub, and they brought the price back down.
Wow. Go Ian's dad.
But
that's power. People
don't
power.
do this enough. They're sort of, we're not going to pay with our
and we're quite passive. You look at your lot, Pierre. One thing goes wrong, they fucking burn the country down.
Yeah.
We just go, oh well, I suppose that's life.
Yeah, we do.
We just sort of shrug, whereas they start getting serious. So that's what we're going to talk about. And yes, so just to remind you once more that we won't be doing another. We're thinking we got one little window in between everyone's various summer holidays. We think on the 11th of August we might be able to do one, but basically between now and sort of early September, that'll be about all you get. So you're just going to have to cope.
Yeah, well, it was the 11th of August, yeah. The midpoint, midsummer.
Yeah.
We should wear like Hawaiian shirts. And
I'll definitely. I like that idea.
I'll definitely be wearing a white T-shirt.
Like
I think that's what you got to do after you got a tan. Yeah. Okay. So let's crack on. So yes, back to. So yeah, thanks again to BT. That was a really nice dinner. It's a nice gaff. What was it called? It's like a sort of
Bibo, I think.
Yeah, sort of Spanish, like modern Spanish style.
Yeah.
So good.
The food was really nice. All of it.
Yeah.
That oxtail slider. I'm going to remember.
Oh, was that the one that was in a bagel?
Yeah, some kind of bread.
Yeah, so I didn't eat it because of my bread thing.
Oh.
Yeah, that was really nice.
No, it was okay, actually.
You should just taken the meat out. And
I did have a little nibble at some of the meat, to be fair. Yeah, what did I like? I don't know, I can't remember, but it was all pretty good.
The roasted avocado?
That was lovely, yeah.
I like the tempura shrimp thing at the start.
I can't eat that.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. I probably had yours.
Yeah. It looked good though.
And you had my pan con tomate. That was a trade-off.
So
yeah. I know, again, I love pan con tomate when it's done well, but I'm just off the bread.
Yeah.
Kudos to you for sticking to it, though.
Well, it's not out of any virtue. It's just that I know it brings out, I think, I heard Rogan talking about it, actually, because he's back on an all-meat thing. And he's just convinced that if he doesn't do that, he feels that there's inflammation around his body. And, Rogan's a few years older than me, obviously in much better shape than me. But regardless, when you're in your 50s, you just get these little aches and pains. And then, I just sort of realised you don't necessarily have to just accept that that's part of life. You can alter your diet. And definitely inflammatory foods such as such as gluten and refined sugar and all that sort of thing. If you can avoid them, then I think you just get less aches and pains. So that's my incentive.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that was all really groovy. I really enjoyed chatting to everyone. In fact, they did a little bit of like speed dating, where normally you just sit next to one person, but between the starters and the main course, they sort of swapped everyone around. And so you were chatting to some bloke called Les, was it?
Yeah, he's on the security side.
He's on the security side. And I was chatting to Alex, who heads up the comms side and who organised all that. So he's already got a shout out from Pierre. And then I was looking her up on LinkedIn.
Gabriella.
Yeah, Gabriella, and I thought she was really good company.
Yeah, she's
really
nice.
good to chat to.
She speaks Swedish, Spanish, and English.
Yeah, well, she's Mexican
Half
Swedish.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
She's the new Tim Whitley.
Right, I didn't know Tim Whitley.
He's like head of research.
She's actually Gabriella. If you listen to this, you've got a typo in your LinkedIn thing where you said what your new job is. She goes, "I'm happy to share I've joined BT Group as managing director, research and network strategies." You need a T in there.
There's a team meeting.
But yeah, no, we had really good chats. Obviously, we're not going to go into any details because it's all off the record, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I always think, we always give credit where it's due. When companies bother to, take us out, which is lovely anyway, but actually get their execs. So Howard Watson was there, obviously, and we had a good chat with him at the end. And just be approachable and be accessible, and I think it counts for a lot. We don't get an explicit story out of it, but we develop our relationship, and we certainly gives us food for thought for what we're about to bang on about now. So thanks again. But yeah, what we're going to bang on about is this week the BT CEO has been there about 5 years, called Philip Jansen, just announced that he's just calling it a day. It's all quite orderly. It's not.
Where was he from, by the way?
He was World
Pay was where he was.
Yeah, he wasn't
before.
from Telecoms.
No, where was he from as in country? Sorry.
He's English.
Is he? But his surname seems sort of Nordic, doesn't it?
Oh.
Yeah, but I don't think he is Nordic. I think he's
Okay,
English.
fine. He's just got a slightly
I
Nordic
think
looking surname.
he's quite matey, I think, with Gavin Patterson. They go back quite a long way.
Right.
I heard. Might have been he might have been a BT back in the day.
Gavin the Face Patterson.
I'll have to look it up on LinkedIn now. But I think he's...
Right. Okay, well, anyway.
I'm sure he's English.
He's for the purpose of this, he's certainly English enough. And yeah, it wasn't one of those things where he's suddenly going, and there's no whiff of scandal or anything like that, but it's slightly unexpected. You just don't normally expect CEOs to call it a day, do you? And we both wrote it up. You wrote it up as well, didn't you, Ian?
Yeah, I did.
And when I wrote it up, my sort of, my initial area of speculation was, while the press release made it sound very orderly, very, we're on top of this, and now we're going through a succession program and all that sort of thing. I still, being a journalist, speculated how much push versus jump was involved. And the reason there might have been push, so there's basically two sides of the ledger. When you're looking at someone's tenure as CEO, you look at the pros and the cons, don't you?
Yeah. He's not on LinkedIn.
Jansen. Right, okay. And yeah, a big mark against his name is just the direction of the BT share price since he's been there. It's like almost half what it was like when he just started.
I don't think he could have done anything about that, to be honest.
I think it's a good point.
And,
Paolo made a post about that, saying that BT is worth what they paid for E.
Right.
Yeah, he was chatting about that last night, actually. Having said, I'm not going to talk about
these little
anything that we
data
spoke about
points are
last night.
interesting, but I don't think he could have done much about the drop in the share price, and I think it could actually have been worse. I think if he'd not done his... because there was a big strategic pivot that happened under Philip Jansen, which people seem to forget about. No one sort of... when I did my write-up, I sort of really focused on what he'd done, and I think the main thing that he did was the 25 million homes will be covered with full fibre by the mid-2020s.
Right. How's that going?
It's gone really well, I think. It's in terms of how quickly they're rolling out. It's 11 million past now. We're in mid-2023.
And it's on track to hit that target.
It's on track, I think. Yes, I think there was signs of a little bit of a slowdown. Maybe one analyst firm was writing, but they've been rolling it out at a quicker pace than I think anybody has been doing in other European countries when they've rolled out full fibre, to go from being at almost nothing a few years ago, if you remember, to being at 11 million premises passed now, in a time when, you know, they've had all sorts of issues to do with things like COVID, you know, and being able to actually, I mean, I know they're classed as critical infrastructure workers, but kind of been very easy having to deal with all of that, and with all the supply chain problems as well that we've had going on in the last few years, to have done it over this period, I think is really quite impressive. And so if they hadn't done that, then I think they'd be in the biggest change that's come about really in the UK telecom market, I think, from a infrastructure perspective in the last few years, has been the availability of full fibre networks.
Yeah.
And
I'm currently the recipient.
We used to be, when the FTTH Council did those tables of homes passed and availability, the UK was always right at the bottom, and it's not at the top now by any means, but it's gone up from something like a negligible percentage to like a third or even 40% of the country now having.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think those are all completely valid.
And I think they were lent on by the regulator to do it for sure. There's no doubt about that. There was a sort of threat that they could even be more rigorous with this separation of Openreach, the bit that does the fibre rollout from the rest of BT.
Yeah.
They could have gone even further with that. That was the sort of threat. Although actually, maybe in some ways it would be a better thing for, I don't know, for shareholders. You don't know. It depends.
I just always found that separation. I remember writing about it because it was a few years ago now, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was being
there was a big fuss, and you know, obviously people like, I don't know, City Fibre or whatever would complain, as is obviously their strategic imperative to do so. I'm
not sure City Fibre was in favour of it being separated.
Oh, wasn't it? I don't think sorry if I'm misrepresenting City Fibre, but I do remember there was some external lobbying. There was some people complaining about it.
I mean, I think there was maybe an argument among the retailers for it to be separated, because their concern is that the original concern is that BT Consumer, which sells fibre products, gets a favourable deal, basically, you know, and that people like Sky and TalkTalk and those other guys that are Openreach customers and that sell fibre products as well are somehow worse off. And so there's been successive levels of regulation introduced over the years to try and target that. But the way to try and make it that it's completely, you know, there's no kind of skew in the market and everybody's on a sort of level playing field would be for Openreach to be a separate entity, perhaps owned, who knows, by BT Consumer and a bunch of other players as well.
But I think
that's it. Whereas what people like City Fibre are concerned about is their ability to compete against Openreach.
Yeah, and that's where we got into the Equinox.
So whoever owns Openreach, it's not like City Fibre would ever have wanted to go and take a stake in Openreach.
No, good point. But I remember when that separation did happen, I was never quite sure what the point of it was. But then the solution BT came out with was this sort of legal separation. But I always thought it was superficial, because the person who hires the Openreach CEO is still the BT CEO. So just by simple lines
I think it's totally
of accountability.
Superficial. Yeah. But it allows the regulators to scrutinise it a bit more easily. And the thing they're looking at is pricing. You know, because if you own the wholesale operation, the retail operation as well, you can squeeze your competitors basically in a way that companies that are only retailers can't. You know, the money's sloshing around the same group, whereas those guys might have a situation where they can't make a decent return on what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know, you could jack up the wholesale fees and make a huge amount of money, and BT Consumer's paying that. So run BT Consumer at a loss, but the money's going back to Openreach, yeah? Whereas the same doesn't go for Sky and TalkTalk. So that's the concern about BT owning Openreach, basically. That's the initial concern. But it's all very heavily scrutinised now by Ofcom, all that stuff.
Totally.
Hence things like, Equinox 2 is, you know, it gets into that sort of territory. So
yeah, well, in Equinox 2, we've done a whole segment on in the pod. And
that's taking the prices the other way, really, to try and fuck over the guys who are like City Fibre.
So just to recap, Equinox is what they call their broad Openreach sort of pricing scheme. Yeah. Which just to recap, Openreach is entirely wholesale fixed line. And they proposed a little while back to drop their prices, and the likes. I think I am representing City Fibre correctly here, and they were like, "What the fuck?"
Yeah.
The reason being that ultimately, and the reason why things like telecoms and very high barrier to entry strategic industries like telecoms need to be heavily regulated is because they could easily just put prices down so much that everyone else just goes out of business.
Yeah.
Unless Goldman Sachs is prepared to throw endless amounts of money at City Fibre, which maybe it would be. God knows it's not short of a bob or two.
Yeah.
But anyway, and actually that comes back to another thing that was a mark against Jan, so a relatively superficial one, but I still probably not insignificant, which was while this Equinox 2 was being mulled over by Ofcom, Philip Janssen gave an interview to the FT where he just sounded excessively bullish about sort of Openreach's competitive position versus everyone else, and said some quotes. I don't know if you can remember any of the quotes.
Well, the headline was BT, something like BT Fibre rollout will end in tears for altnets.
Right.
That was the more or
and
less the headline.
There was talk of crushing competition or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about this last night at the dinner because the FT story that caused all this. Oh my God, they said things like that. I was like, he'd said things like that for about 6 quarters in a row. I mean, I'd done a story, but of course, don't have the same impact as FT, where I'd almost use the same headline that was in that FT story.
Yeah.
But Ofcom doesn't notice light reading in the way that it notices the FT, and so
and it was
we can't move the market in quite the same way.
And I remember in the pod when we spoke about it, I was sort of in the middle in so much as it was legitimate reporting. He said what he said, but I do think it was salaciously sub-edited such that you had like initially very curated, cherry-picked quotes that painted a more aggressive picture, and then I've noticed the mainstream media quite often does this. So you go, he said we're going to beat everyone, and then right at the end it goes, and the full quote is we're going to beat everyone, but we're still really nice and we want to get on or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
something that will moderate.
It's the suggestion that there's only going to be one national network again in the future. I think that's obviously why Ofcom's gone. Hang on a minute.
That's true, and that was a slight sort of semantical stumble by him, because he was just trying to emphasise national as opposed to patchy. He was trying to make a coverage point, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Whereas it came over like he said, we're going to be the only network, i.e. we're going to be a monopoly.
Yes, that's true. That is true, yeah.
But, I mean, I remember when I wrote that up, I felt a bit for Janssen, because I thought, partly what we've just been talking about, which was some of the more selective sub-editing of it. But also, I thought it was a bit frivolous of Ofcom to get so carried away about it.
I didn't really understand why they got so carried away about it. I mean, companies, when it's a heavily regulated industry, obviously, and the idea of it going back to being a monopoly, which was the sort of suggestion, I suppose, with the story, isn't something they're going to be happy about, and they're going to want to have a look at that. But companies talk, they talk bullshit about their rivals all the time. Yeah, we're much better. What do they expect him to say? Oh, actually, we're not really very good, and we'll probably just lose out to City Fibre in a few areas, but hey, what the hell? I mean, he's obviously, when he does his interviews, he's trying to shore up the swiftly dropping BT share price.
Yeah, it's true. We can't criticise him for a lower share price.
He's not going to go on there and say, we're not doing very well. There's going to be...
we're having a bit of a mare, if I'm honest.
I mean, the awkward position that he's in, I think, from a shareholder perspective, is that BT doesn't really have anything to gain out of its full fibre rollout. They only have something to lose. They're in a completely defensive position.
Right.
BT has the whole of the broadband market except for some stuff that's with Virgin Media O2, yeah? That's the historical position they're coming from, is that everybody in this country, let's assume pretty much every home now has some kind of broadband.
Yeah.
It's all on either Openreach infrastructure or Virgin Media O2.
Not City Fibre?
No, but I'm saying the historical position of it coming from. Then you had the altnets coming along, like City Fibre and some of the others, and GigaClear and these guys.
GigaNet.
Well, there's two. There's GigaClear.
Oh, there's 2
and
gigas.
There's dozens of them.
Only one of them brought us bottles of Irish whiskey, though.
Yeah, and so they can only lose out. They can only lose. They can't. Now you could say, well, if you upsell your fibre products, you can earn a bit more each month from selling higher speed. But it hasn't really worked out that way. I mean, it's like mobile prices; they just carry on going down. And as soon as you get rivals coming into the market, our fibre. I mean, we're not full fibre where we are. We're sort of fibre to the curb, but we're paying less now, I think, than we were even after the inflation rate increases that went up, this year,
Right.
than we were for ADSL products years ago. I'm
Yeah,
sure.
so you got this broader
they don't
telecoms
have anything
malaise
to gain.
of people expect more for less constantly. That's just the way it goes.
But he couldn't not do it, because then they lose even more risk potentially to City Fibre and these guys. They might be in a position where they end up with a fraction of the market if they just sat there and gone, we're not investing in fibre. That was the risk. But the shareholders, I think, are looking at it thinking, this is costing a huge amount of money. Like the amount they spend on their capital intensity, which is like expenditure over revenues, has gone up from, I think, about 15% in the Gavin Patterson years to 25% under Philip Yan. That's a huge amount, excluding spectrum licenses. To spend a quarter of your sales on capex is more than any other European telco incumbent. Right. It's a lot. I mean, usually that ratio is somewhere between 15 and 20%.
Okay,
and that's largely to do with the fibre dig, and so free cash flow's gone down, and you look at the sales and they're just completely flat. I think they were down 1% in the last fiscal year. So there's no it's quite a hard story to sell to shareholders to sort of say there's no growth story, but if they didn't do it, they'd be worse off. But that's, if I'm an investor and I'm looking at BT and you're trying to explain why it's gone like that, they've gone through various things where they've tried to make one thing or another the big growth opportunity. I remember, 10, 15 years ago, there was a period when it was BT Global. It was very much trying to sort of position the enterprise unit as the growth story, something Orange is trying to do now. And then it kind of moved to mobile a little bit, I suppose, after the EE acquisition and TV, with Gavin Patterson trying to position them as a rival to Sky and spending a huge amount on sports rights and going down that pay TV route.
Yeah.
I think that was just a massive failure, wasn't it? I think we have to sort of agree.
Yeah, we were chatting about it again because this was over dinner. It's off the record. I'm not going to say who it was, but I was having a little chat about that, and some people reckon they should have stayed the course on the sports rights. I mean,
they had more to lose. The problem was, you imagine they tried to stay in that game and they're trying to do a full fibre rollout. You imagine what their financials might look like now.
Yeah.
You've got to, because Sky's going to go hard as the pay TV incumbent, basically. They're going to go as hard as BT does on trying to look after their position, with Premier League matches and all of that lot. And so they'd had to spend a huge amount potentially to carry on winning matches. And then they'd also have to spend money on a huge fibre project. I mean, I think they'd be in real trouble now. And they obviously thought we've got more to lose from not looking after the broadband side of things. Because that's where they come from.
Yeah, so. I think those are all good points. I was just looking at their share price over like the fullness of time. And basically, if you bought BT shares like 30 years ago, you haven't made any money.
Yeah.
And one thing to further mitigate, to not place too much blame at the feet of Janssen over the share price, is the broader trend was on a distinct downward trajectory anyway before he joined.
But, I mean, there
was a little bit of a peak, and it has kept going low, but it's just kept going. But then it has since about 2020, it's flatlined. Right. So he could argue that he's at least arrested that downward slide.
And I suppose someone coming in now, there's a bottoming out point, isn't there, where it can't go much lower.
Because it's got all these assets.
It's got all these assets. It's worth something, clearly. So it's maybe now at a point where it doesn't go much lower, and therefore anybody coming in is in quite a good situation.
So its market cap's about 12 billion, which I think Paolo's publicly said.
Well, is
what they paid.
Is
what they paid for
12.5 for EE. So. It's really low. I'd be hard to see it going a lot lower than that, really, I think.
But when was the EE thing? Was that 2016?
2016, early 2016.
So that was the historical peak of a share price of, I'm just looking at Google Finance.
Yeah, because they bought EE.
Yeah, and it's been in steady decline ever since then. Presumably as investors sort of looked at what the benefits of the thing were and decided there weren't that much. But yeah, so yeah.
Well, I don't know. Maybe again, they could be worse off if they'd not bought EE and had an integrated operator.
Totally.
Because the trouble is that you made this point that if you compare how they've done to how other telcos have done across Europe in the last 5-6 years. They're all in the same trajectory. The only exception to the rule is Deutsche Telekom, and that's only because they own T-Mobile US, which has been I mean, if you look at T-Mobile, because it's listed separately as well in the US, if you look at its share price, it's crazy. It looks like an internet stock.
Right.
It actually looks like an internet stock.
Mad?
Yeah. But it's if you can sign up millions of new customers every month and give them smartphones, you're a growth stock.
Yeah.
None of the telcos in Europe can do that because they're heavily saturated markets with loads of competitors.
And also, I mean, T-Mobile US has got great advantage of its incumbent competitors just
Screwing
being
up with
strategically shit over the last 10 years.
Yeah. So if you're in a market where there's only 3 players anyway, and your 2 big rivals have tried to go down the media route themselves and sort of taken their eye off the ball, and you've got a huge opportunity, and you've got a clever guy who's really good at marketing in charge, and and every month, it's every quarter rather, you've got millions of new subscribers, it seems. Then you look like an internet stock to the investor community. Because
I was just thinking about that too. So we've spoken many times about the folly of the AT&T acquisition of Time Warner, and in terms of value, that completely eclipses anything that Verizon did. But in terms of comedy value, the fact that Verizon's big punt was to buy AOL and Yahoo, 2 90s internet brands, and then lo and behold, it didn't get any benefit from it. Ended up flogging them, doing a fire sale and flogging them for a fraction of what it paid. Just between the two of them, it's real Keystone Cops shit, isn't it?
It's a lot of these. You do wonder about some of the decisions that get taken at a senior level in terms of M&A, not just in telco. The financial sector. You remember the sort of RBS, ABN AMRO stuff, and things like that going on.
Like Vodafone buying things like Mannesmann and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, but I suppose at least that's
But anyway,
they like the idea of having these big mega deals because it's like building HS2 train line. It's like, oh, look what we did. We built this huge train line across the country at a cost of 100 billion, and that's what I'm known for as Prime Minister. That I was a guy who signed off on it.
I mean, I can talk about stuff I said last night as much as I can remember it because there was some very nice white wine that was flowing fairly freely, and we both had an old-fashioned. That was half decent old-fashioned.
They were nice old-fashions, actually.
Kick off.
Much better than most other ones that I get in this country.
But I remember going off on one, just because if you're fortunate enough to be sat and having a dinner with someone who does sit at the top table in a sort of FTSE 100 company, it's just interesting just to know, what goes on. And, and I just went off on a bit of a tangent going, sometimes it just seems like they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Obviously, it wasn't being rude enough to direct this at any of our dinner hosts. But, some of these decisions they make, like big M&A or whatever, I think this particularly came up just because I think Gabriella's strategy is her thing. And I was just musing on the concept of strategy. Yeah. And what is it? Do they have some risk board or something like that? What does strategy actually involve? And there was another BT person called Anna. Hi, Anna, who's also in strategy. So that's one of the reasons we're going off on these strategy tangents. And I was just trying to work out, sometimes you just think they're in this little boardroom echo chamber. You can just see them sort of wargaming it and going, this will be a really great idea. And then, even at the time, people are going, are you fucking sure? And then when it inevitably turns out to be a rubbish idea, it just makes you wonder how these very intelligent, highly paid, credentialed people just so often make these bad M&A calls. Yeah. And I think perhaps one of the reasons, and this is back to the BT share price, perhaps it's a bit counterintuitive how you run a company like BT. You'd think, shouldn't it just be as simple as sell more stuff or cut some overheads or something like that? But then they've got to, what are investors in a company like BT actually looking for? And then they've also got to project to regulators and politicians and that sort of thing.
Well, that gets to the problem of, because I think one of the conversations that was going on was about telecoms being critical infrastructure, and obviously, very much needed in any economy these days. But they're not growth stocks, are they? And they probably don't look that appealing to the investment community. But to be honest, that's how any mature business looks, isn't it, really? And a lot of those businesses would qualify as critical infrastructure as well. I mean, they're probably in better shape than the water companies. Yeah? Or the train lines.
Well, I mean, there's lots of lobbying for them to be renationalised.
If you had to list the sectors or the bits of infrastructure that you class as critical, there's not a lot that's more critical than water, is there?
No.
Or transportation or energy. And look how badly some of these companies are doing. And I think the trouble is that it's all very well when you invent a new product and nobody owns it, and then all of a sudden you go off on this spree where for 2 years that's all anybody buys, which will probably happen with the Vision Pro at some point when they get a version out that's a bit less.
That's
clunky
the Apple sort of VR.
Yeah, and obviously happened. They've done it successive times now with the iPod and the iPhone, and then to a lesser extent things like iPads. Companies that can do that and reinvent themselves in a way are always.
And Apple's just a margin machine as well.
But
I mean, the margins they make on everything, including like the pods and all that sort of thing, is just sick.
But their share price wouldn't be the same if people weren't expecting growth. And that's one of the reasons why you look at the companies that are big tech companies that all of a sudden starting to look a little bit more like telecom stocks, not in terms of how much they're worth, but how it's performing, is because where's Facebook's next growth story? Well, actually, at the moment it might be Threads, but where's Google's next growth story? Where's Amazon's next growth story? It's not immediately obvious in some of these cases anymore where growth comes from. Remember what happened to Netflix? When it had that quarter when it lost a couple of million subscribers, and everybody was like, "Oh,
it's over.
It's over. They've basically reached what Telecoms reached. Everybody who's ever going to get it has got it.
And then it's just a matter of minimising churn.
And then it's like, oh my God, it goes like that.
And then it went back up.
So you mentioned Apple, they're mad.
They're at the top right now.
Yeah, but people expect things from them.
But I'm just looking at this year. This isn't in any way, this is just an aside. This isn't to contradict or augment anything you said. Yeah, since January, start of January, they were $126. Now they're $190. It's mad. And they haven't really done anything that special, have they?
They announced their quarter is on the 3rd.
Right, and they just basically just keep making shitloads of money.
They make shitloads of money because every new iPhone model that comes out, even if it doesn't really do much that's different, they still manage to shift a load of them.
Yeah.
And then there's some anticipation about things like the Vision Pro as well built into that. So whereas other companies can't do that, Facebook, it's not really that obvious where the next batch of growth comes from, I don't think. Well, all right, Threads, okay, but until that came along. What has that done to their share price? I'd be interested to know.
Actually, it's funny you mentioned, I'll go and look at them in a sec, but my gut feel is that Facebook's share price has rather counterintuitively shot up, but one of the reasons is it did fall off a cliff for a little while. Just to finish, before I get off that Apple... Google Finance, their market cap is exactly $3 trillion.
Yeah,
crazy.
Right,
I think they're number one. Yeah, they must be.
What were we talking about? Meta, it will be.
Sorry, Meta, yeah. So that's, the whole metaverse thing for them clearly hasn't
800 billion.
Yeah, but then if we look at them over the last few years, they fell off a cliff because of shitty earnings and I think bad subscriber news in early 22. They went down just in over February 22. They went down from about $330 to by March $200.
Yeah.
So that's almost, that's like a third of the value or something or more. But let me just quickly finish. But then they've been recovering. So their nadir in that time was November 22. With a value of $90, and now they're back up to $315. So
that's an absolute
go figure. Yeah.
But the issue that the telcos find themselves in with declining share prices or flat share prices, and it's not, to me, it's partly a telco issue, but it's partly not a telco issue. It's partly just a problem of capitalism. And how this incessant drive for growth, companies have to be growing every year. GDP has to go up all the time, otherwise investors aren't interested. Growth.
And there's going to become a time where naturally growth isn't possible.
Yeah, unless you have this creative destruction thing with new companies coming along and new things emerging and old companies fade away. But telecom operators haven't really been able to do that. We still need what they do. This is the problem. It's not as though we can make do without connectivity. Someone has to do that in the same way that someone has to provide the energy to our homes and someone has to provide the water to our homes. But what happens to those companies when that's all they're doing and they have just a flat
rate?
Where
they're going to get any
pays
significant
money for that? They're not going to get growth.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think maybe it was in the last pod. I remember speculating that if all these telcos had just sat there and just done their day job properly, their shareholder would probably be better
off maybe,
than if they tried all these wacky, buying media companies and getting into football and all that sort of thing.
But they're just doing what the the sort of world that we live in makes you do.
Yes.
Really.
No, you're completely
we
right.
live in a planned economy, and that's not very good either for other reasons. But
and then back to the matter at hand. If you're a CEO of a big company, you're expected to do some kind of legacy-defining shit.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to be 5 years down the line. People go, "What have you done?" And then you just go, "Well, I haven't fucked anything up." That's not enough, is it?
Well, we're a healthy 20% up.
Yeah. We're podding. Stop calling him. So that's that. Let me just get it back on track because we only got about an hour left. So that was, did he do well or didn't he? In my piece, Paolo and Kester from CCS Insight were as usual the quickest to get out comments. So I sort of copied and pasted quotes from both of them, and actually they were quite contrasting. Kester was a bit more down on him, going, well, I think he called it a roller coaster ride, and he's talking about this, that, and the other that's gone a bit wrong. But then Paolo was more supportive of him. He was going, well, he's navigated him through a tricky time and all that sort of thing, and he's probably right for him to say my work here is done. And so I just concluded, okay, that's a good point. There's two ways of looking at it. And as we've just concluded, the share price alone is not fair to judge him on that for all the external reasons we were just talking about. And maybe he was just there to manage this period of transition, bit of retrenchment away from some of the more frivolous Patterson ventures into content or whatever.
I mean, I'm more upbeat on him.
Yeah,
to be honest, I think
So you're more on the Paolo than the Kester
he's turned
side.
BT into a full fibre company with 11 million homes passed with full fibre. If they'd not done that, if they'd just done what Patterson was doing, which is like, let's focus on sports rights and, that we can carry on doing our sort of VDSL stuff, they could have been in a really bad situation, because that's their legacy business, is broadband to people's homes, really.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's the mobile stuff as well, but actually on mobile, he's done an incredibly good job. If you look at they probably have the best 5G network in the country, right?
Yeah.
Well, people
Certainly
like Vodafone have been...
Certainly if root metrics, they always get top of the pile on that.
But I don't base it on that. I base it on what I hear from people and analysts, and talking to the execs and looking at the sites and looking at the, you form your own views on it. And they've probably got the best 5G network in the country. It's what, 2/3 of, I think they're getting up to sort of 2/3 of homes of population coverage now. And they've got very good people, I think, in charge of that rollout. It seems they've done a very good job there of how to plan it, and so he's had success there. I think on the whole, what telcos are supposed to do, which is provide connectivity infrastructure, I think he's done a really good job.
He's done the day job well.
Yeah, all right. You could be critical of him in terms of he's not found a growth opportunity for BT beyond the connectivity.
But then we can't be critical of that if at the same time we take the piss out of theirs when they do try and it fails.
And also, could he realistically have done it anyway with the commitment that's needed to be made on those infrastructure projects, spending a quarter of sales on rollout of these networks? Now, I can understand why investors might go, oh my God, well, what's there to be gained from this? We don't make any money from selling fibre connections over DSL connections, and we don't see a big revenue growth opportunity. Meanwhile, you're spending a huge amount of money, so profits are going down, and the dividends are being cut. That's a sort of investor take on it.
Yeah.
But from our point of view, as people in this, from the country's perspective, this is the trouble with critical infrastructure companies that are heavily regulated, is that we need them for everything else in the economy that works well, like working from home, all that stuff in COVID.
Yeah.
Where would we have been without BT during the lockdown?
Indeed. We'd
have been screwed, frankly. And yet investors look at it in a completely different way, and they're sort of caught between these two things. Yeah. And but I think he's done it. I actually think he's done a pretty good job.
Yeah, I think so. Are you before we get into speculating about who might take his place? Are you happy with the narrative that he's just thinking, all right, I've done what I came here for, it's time to go on to new challenges, or chill out? I mean, he's got a few quid, maybe he's just going to go and buy a yacht.
I'm not sure, and we didn't really get any intel on that last night either, but and people haven't really... I noticed it's interesting, when Neil left, who we get on the pod a few times, and everybody's speculating about, what's the story behind this. And yet, when the CEO leaves, there's not been as much speculation in some of the write-ups as I'd have expected about why is he left now. I mean, I think was it Paolo? Somebody made the point. One of the two analysts you mentioned about the sort of slip up with comments to the FT.
Yeah.
And obviously that put him in maybe in a bit of an awkward position with Ofcom.
I think it was Kester in terms of the quotes that I put in my story. I think it might have been Kester.
I mean, you could say
he was the more critical.
Maybe he's come under some pressure from shareholders because of what the share price has done.
Yeah, it was Kester,
under his watch. But here's the thing: when somebody else comes in, I don't see it changing their strategy.
No, so that moves quite naturally onto who might be a successor. And in fact, I won't name them, but someone when we were talking about this over dinner sort of approved of my take, which is, it will depend entirely on what the board has in mind strategically. Back to strategy.
Yeah.
Is the board just going to go, all right, fair enough, we're a utility, we'll just keep investing in our main asset, which is this fibre network. Keep EE on even keel. Try not to lose any share to our competitors. But just have a steady ship. Or do we want to bring in some kind of visionary who's going to try some wacky shit and maybe send the share price up? And that presumably, if this is obviously a very reductive binary way of looking at it. I'm sure it's a lot more nuanced than that. But that will affect the kind of person they bring in, and the person people speculate about, like Paolo in the quote I put in my piece, is Mark Alera, who comes from the EE side. Actually, that was another little tangent, interesting discussion. Again, I won't name it or anyone because it was all just over the dinner table, but it was an interesting chat about the BT brand versus the EE brand. Now, intuitively, when they bought EE, I thought, well, EE's the more sexy brand. BT, especially now with that, where it looks like a street sign, the logo's not very exciting. And you just thought, yeah, BT should just jump on that brand. But, the point was made, and it convinced me to some degree that BT is just an institution. People as old as me can remember like ad campaigns involving a little fluffy chick called Busby or something like that.
Yeah.
And we can remember when it was privatised, and that was one of those big 80s stock sort of capitalism frenzies, wasn't it? And so maybe, actually, even though the brand might seem a little bit dusty and not very sexy, maybe it is still the stronger brand in terms of... Because if we're talking about as a utility, what do you want most from utility in terms of branding? You want trust. You want people to feel that that's a brand that they trust, that everything's be all right. And you could argue that BT has got more trust around the brand than EE.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think Mark Alera would be a bit of a weird person in some ways for them to bring in as CEO,
right?
To be honest.
Why is that?
And I think he's probably the likeliest option if they're going to go with an internal candidate, because he's obviously head of one of their very big units. It can't be somebody like, who's head of Openreach at the moment? Clive Selly, is it?
Yeah.
It can't be him because there's supposed to be legal separation. Separate, yeah. And the BT business, I think it's just called BT Business now, is it? Because they basically brought the whole of the government and corporate stuff together and just called it BT Business, so that's the other unit. It's quite small. It'd be weird. It'd be like the head of Orange Business being the CEO of the whole group. So if they're going to... And
like one of our people we were having dinner with, Howard Watson, who's very senior, and he obviously wasn't making any comment.
CTOs don't become CEOs.
Yeah, and he wasn't making any comment on this one way or the other. But the gut feel is it's just not... CTOs prefer to stay on the techie side.
CEOs
they don't want to deal with all this political bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that as an option at all.
No.
And then the only other people who do become CEOs within the boardroom structure are CFOs.
Yeah.
And they've got Simon Louth, I think. But
I
think
Vodafone.
Yeah, but Simon Louth, I think, has been there for a long time in that role and seems fairly long time in that role. It doesn't really see... He's not super young. He's not a very young CFO. I mean, I'm not trying to be rude to him personally, but he'd be...
No spring chicken.
And I just think the thing about Mark Alera to me is that he's sort of going back to that sort of Gavin Patterson flamboyance a little bit.
Right.
He's a bit more kind of his manner and his kind of personality, I think, is a little bit more like that. And he's, because he's come from the consumer side, he's more I suspect about he's more in the kind of TV.
I think he's a marketer in
services and marketing
roots,
camp
isn't he?
in a way than he is in the. To me, this is interesting. Your thing about if the board decides to do something and get a visionary in, or if they decide to stick. To me, even though he's actually in a telco, he'd be more if they feel the second thing, that they wanted to get somebody who's a little bit visionary. So. And I think the risk of doing
the typical safe pair of hands is like the CFO, promotion,
or someone from outside.
Yeah.
But
from a more bean countery sort of.
Well, not as a bean counter. I just think let's carry on with the fibre rollout and get this done, and let's focus on the 5G rollout, and those are the critical things for BT to be focusing on. I think if they get somebody in who's going to go, oh, we need to get back into sports rights again, or we need to sort of talk up some new 5G applications that we're trying to develop with some internet company that we've bought a little, share price. I just think that would be really risky for them to do that, because it's going to be costly for them to try and go down that route anyway, at a time when they've already got huge costs to finish this fibre build out, and it could distract attention and resources from the fibre build out at a time when these altnets are still there and they're still, they're not going away. And then you risk losing market share in your core business. For someone to come in and try and change the strategy that they've embarked on under Philip Jansen, I think would be really stupid.
So I think we both agree that the sensible appointment, so presumably the BT board is hanging on our every word, would be a sort of safe pair of hands, someone who's just going to sort of look at the current momentum, current trajectory, and just not fuck it up first and foremost. I mean, there was some talk even of, like, from a regulatory point of view, someone like Sharon White, who used to head up Ofcom. But I think bringing in a civil servant type,
I think somebody who I won't name viewed that as would be an absolute disaster for them.
Right? Yeah.
Which I sort of see.
I don't.
I kind of agree with that.
That's not their skill set. I mean, running Ofcom's one thing, running a commercial operation's another.
Yeah.
And then someone who always comes up, like when Patterson left, before Jansen was appointed, someone who's in the rumour mill is our boss, Stephen Carter. Yeah. Who, his credentials, as we've spoken about in recent pods, his credentials are totally brilliant for anything to do with telecoms. I mean, the two reasons why I don't think it would be him is, firstly, he had the opportunity 5 years ago, or potentially had the opportunity. I'm not claiming to have any inside knowledge.
Might change his mind.
Yeah, or he might have gone for the interview and when they said, what's your greatest weakness? And he fucked up the answer.
They don't do interviews like that, do they, at that level?
Because he said, I'm too much of a perfectionist. That's what you say, innit?
We don't think that's a weakness. Well, I don't give a fuck what you think.
Yeah. Well, that's my answer. Deal with it. But I think, and there's never been an indication that he's not happy here, and that's good. We like him in charge. But the other one is that he's on the board of Vodafone. So I just
you have to leave that, obviously.
Yeah. And it just wouldn't work.
Do you know what the sort of positive take on BT over the next few years is? But you have to take a long view, I think, of it, like a Chinese-style view, and not think about it on a quarterly basis.
Yeah.
Is that by the time they get to 2025, 2026, they'll have finished their fibre build-out under their plans. 25 million homes passed. Mm-hmm. So your capital intensity should drop a lot.
It should, yeah.
That will also allow you, by the way, when you've done that, to shut down a lot of equipment they have at the moment, which I think came up last night as well as a sort of topic. And anyway, it's on the record before, because Howard Watson's talked about that a lot. Getting rid of a lot of old exchanges, getting rid of a lot of legacy, which is taking more costs out. Then your 130,000 employees, including contractors and part-time staff, a lot of those are involved in the fibre build-out. So you can massively cut your headcount there. And then you can rely on things like automation and
to anticipate our next segment.
Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about soon to slim down your workforce anymore, which is something Jansen said, I think, at the last earnings call. I mean, he had quite aggressive numbers for how much he thought he could cut.
With the BT bot 1000.
All of a sudden, you've got a company that maybe isn't growing in terms of sales, but its margins have improved dramatically because it's finished this massive infrastructure project. And let's remember, that's a once in 100 years infrastructure project. That's not like putting in new boxes at either end to boost your speeds a bit, or putting up some base stations on masts. That's a huge capex investment to go around digging up streets and hanging fibre from poles. And once that's done, I mean, you look at Telefónica's capital intensity and what's happened since it's finished most of its fibre build out in Spain, and it's a lot better than it was. It's in terms of it kind of going down. So there's a view that BT could be a massively more profitable company in the future, with a much lighter workforce, dealing with people in a more kind of internet style way, And now, I'm not saying this is necessarily going to happen, by the way. There's all sorts of things that could disrupt that. But that's the positive take on it. But I think if you're going to buy into that story, you have to be in it for the long game, And the trouble with the parts of the investment community is that they look at things on a kind of quarterly basis, don't they?
And it's a funny thing.
I think Ian should throw his hat in the game.
Ian. I know. Sometimes it would be fun if a company just went, fuck it. We're getting Dave from sales
and then
in charge of the whole company.
Am I Dave from sales?
Well, just a relative unknown. That's all I mean.
Yeah.
And obviously, you're not a relative unknown. You're famous because of this podcast.
Yeah.
But no, it would be fun just to have a dilettante.
Well, I don't think it would go very well for them if they put me in charge, because there's lots I don't know about running a business, basically.
Yeah. And they'd have to rule you out every Friday so you could do the podcast.
Exactly. So we can scratch my name off the list of candidates that they've drawn up.
Are you officially refusing the job then?
Well, if they wanted to come and talk to me, I'd sort of ask what they're going to pay and say maybe I'll do a year in the job.
Yeah.
Just have one of those meetings like they have in movies where they just sit down and they just put a bit of paper.
Oh yeah, that's the firm with Tom Cruise, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. It's a bit of paper with a figure on it.
Yeah, brilliant.
There you go.
He realises he's working for the mob.
That's a lot of zeros. So yeah, we haven't really got a clue, but it'll be interesting to see who it is.
Yeah.
But I think we do agree that they should probably make a Conservative rather than a wacky choice.
I think so. I don't think those wacky choices have really worked out in the past, and I mean they've never gone really wacky, have they? But
no.
Let's say you got somebody, right, who's like, I mean, I know this is...
Well, the Janssen was a bit out of left field, in so much as he's not a telco guy.
He was. But imagine they got somebody like Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Now, Elon Musk, obviously, it's never going to happen, but let's just be ridiculous.
Like he needs more work.
Say Elon Musk came and gave up all of his other stuff.
Right.
And he was going to run BT. Do you think he'd be able to turn the company around and change
it? I think
he'd have people under him who do know. He's good at delegating, I think.
Yeah, and it's a good thought exercise because he would at least try and just utterly. He's the sort of person that would just tries to completely rethink the whole paradigm. And you go, right now we're a utility. I'm going to turn us into like he's working on this thing to try and recoup some of his sort of sunk costs in Twitter, turning it into an everything app like WeChat. Yeah. He'd probably just try a massive roll of the dice, which could end disastrously. But then turn it into this everything app. But
then I think I don't think he'd be able to do it because he'd be coming into a company that's heavily regulated, where your job is to provide the things we were talking about. You need to provide universal service obligation. You need to meet these coverage targets. You need to do this. You need to do that. You're not there to come up with wacky new apps. You're there to make sure that there's gigabit broadband for everybody. So and all of a sudden you go, oh, this is just impossible. I wanted to make it into a rocket company that flies to Mars and it needs to do broadband. I'm out.
Imagine how bored someone like Musk would be doing that.
I don't think the CEOs sometimes at these companies actually, I don't want to say they don't matter, but I think the idea of getting visionaries in to turn around heavily regulated telcos is just a bit of a stupid idea.
I think that was one of my drunken tangents when we were talking about this last night. I sometimes think you could put a fucking pot plant in charge of half the companies. It wouldn't make any difference. Which raised some eyebrows. And, obviously I don't literally mean that. But to your point, it does sometimes feel... Because I think the more substantial point you're making is that they're so constrained that a lot of the jobs kind of dictated to them.
Well, I think pot plant, is going a bit far, but I think you need someone who's a good manager.
Yeah.
You don't want to have somebody who goes... an example of that is if you have some accounting error that's really bad, which can happen because you've not got good managers in and people underneath you, and you can make some colossal mistake just because you didn't oversee the business in the right way. And we've not had that with a lot of European telcos that I'm aware of for a while, have we? There's no one's really made some colossal yeah, actually BT, there was those accounting issues in Italy under Patterson, but
that's just one
whether
of
you
those
could
outright,
trace that
I think.
back to him being sloppy, I don't
No,
know.
I mean that's a bit
of an
like the stuff
outlier,
that happened to Ericsson. Sometimes you just get a few bad apples fucking things up.
but you want somebody who can meet with regulators and talk to them, who's got everything working well, and it's like running a ship in the Navy or something. Everything has to run smoothly, but
An administrator.
an administrator.
I mean, I often think that about politics. I was listening to a pod the other day, and they were dissing Rishi Sunak for not having any vision and any ideals. And I thought, well, hold careful what you fucking wish for.
Yeah.
Because there's been plenty of ideological people through history.
Yeah.
You know, some obvious ones spring to mind where the ideology has been incredibly destructive. I think politicians and I guess leaders of massive organisations on the whole should first and foremost be good administrators.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think historically have done really well in France. They got that Grande École, there's something or other for the civil servants.
Polytechnic? No.
No, it's where all the orange executives go. Grand École, and then they get the top business jobs afterwards.
And it's like well known as being like the elite place for being an administrator, for being a civil servant or something like that. And you know, fair play to France. It seems to have the right idea. In fact, France gets quite a few of those little things right. I was just listening to a pod talking about energy, and everyone else is shitting themselves about energy, and France has just been well ahead of the curve with nuclear power for decades, hasn't it?
I think per capita we're number one.
Maybe that's one of the reasons, because they go to these places and they learn how to just run things well. And I'm not saying France is run permanently. Certainly the recent riots imply otherwise. But there's something to be said. I mean, the broader point I'm trying to make is there's something to be said for just for administration itself to be a core competence. Yeah. And maybe it's understatus. Maybe people are looking past it when actually that's the most important thing.
Yeah. The riots, by the way, my sister lives there, and she's saying like it's grossly
exaggerated.
Oh, right.
Yeah, because even I'm watching the British news, and I'm like, oh my God, and I text my family, and they're like, yeah, it's
we're right.
It's
just
fine.
Some little
you look
bit
out
of town,
the window, and it's totally fine.
Some little bit of town, someone set a bin on fire, and we're just going mad about it.
It's people that they use that to loot.
Yeah.
And just steal like iPhones and
which happens plenty. I mean, God, you look at the States. I think during the summer of 2020 when you had all the BLM stuff, that often just disintegrated into looting.
Oh, here, remember like was it Tottenham like in 2011?
Yeah. When that guy got killed by the police, and
they set a building on fire and stuff, and just raided the Apple
and
store.
there will always be opportunists who in chaos see opportunity. Anyway, all right, I think we've done that one. We've only got about 40 minutes left, so we better move on. So, AI. So we went Omdia, which is the analyst firm that is also owned by Informa, which also owns us. It owns us. They did an event where they got a bunch of people, including us, up onto the top floor of our building here, and did some presentations.
Out the window and said being replaced with AI.
Yeah, he said you're all fired. My fucking phone could do a better job than you. And we just had presentations and discussions about AI. And I wrote it up. I wrote it up fairly quickly and sort of did a more superficial job. And as ever, you spent a bit more time on it and did more of a deep dive. Including, I was just looking at your story. You got that funny AI generated photo where
a bit of an opinionated thing. Sort of pushing back on some of it.
I was just going to mention that AI photo. Someone had said to a generative. So we were mainly talking about generative AI, which we should stress. I can't remember what the other one is, but generative AI is where it can actually create things.
Yeah.
And so you can ask it, for example, you could ask it to write a story in the style of Ian Morris.
Yeah.
And basically what it does is it uses a hell of a lot of processing power and a hell of a lot of like large language models and machine learning to go off, find out typically how you write by looking at loads of examples of you writing, and then it will get the subject matter. So it could say, write about the colour of orange juice in the style of Ian Morris, and then it'll go off and find out about the colour of orange juice and then somehow meld the two, and it's all quite clever. Yeah. But it's not actually creating anything, it's just synthesising.
Well, that was the point of my story, really, because I'm increasingly object actually to the use of the artificial intelligence as an expression. I just think is, I thought James gave a really good presentation, by the way. James Crawshaw, Omdia. I mean, I always like his take on things because I think he's one of those analysts who's prepared to be a little bit sceptical about things and question things.
And he's a really smart guy.
And he talked about the hype cycle and how we've had this before with, telcos love to jump on the bandwagon of any new technology that comes along, and he was saying a few years ago we had big data and we've had the metaverse and we've had virtualization, and none of these things has actually really done much for telcos. And I suspect generative AI won't either, is my take. But the whole sort of idea of this being, I mean, you call it artificial intelligence. Presumably, you're calling it artificial because you're implying that the intelligence is something like the human variety of intelligence.
Yeah, non-human intelligence.
Yeah, but it's like on that kind of level, and it's not at all like that. It's not. I mean, I thought Simon Poulter made a really interesting point that I sort of kind of slightly nicked in my story, that all you're talking about really is a very sophisticated search engine that can take.
Yeah.
You tell it to do something and it goes around and ransacks the internet for words and explanations put together by people and then assembles them in some new form, basically. But it would never do... And I think the points I alluded to in my story were like those moments of like real genius that have come about in human history, like Einstein's theory of relativity, or someone inventing a new style of guitar playing, or something.
Yeah.
It's never going to do anything.
You couldn't
like
have
that.
an Einstein or a Hendrix.
And it wouldn't even be able to do what we do.
But maybe you could one day. That's the thing.
Well, it could, but you wouldn't do it with generative AI. You'd have to do it with something else, because all generative AI does is
proper general AI.
Ian, could you create a new style of guitar?
Now you're doing the whole what is it? What's that film? iRobot. No, but people can. Other people can.
Yeah.
So it's like
Jimi Hendrix can.
But I don't even think it can do. So I'm obviously not on the level of Jimi Hendrix or any of those people, but what I can do is I can go out and speak to somebody about something that's happened. And so there was this thing in one of the presentations about journalists and market analysts being jobs that are susceptible to AI. And I was thinking, well, only of everything they're writing or everything they're analysing, all their research is based on stuff that's already regurgitating stuff that's on the internet, basically.
Well, yeah,
you get dumber and dumber then.
If I go off and do a load of phone calls and dig around and come up with an idea for a story, and I go and speak to a few people, and then I go and and meet somebody else about it and get some views on it and put together a piece that you couldn't find anywhere on the internet. There's no way that generative AI can replicate that because it's not on the internet.
Yeah. I suppose
it's also very wrong about people. I found, like, if you say write an article about this person, there'll be 2 or 3 facts that are just completely wrong.
Well, because one of the sources. I mean, James. I don't think you put that slide in your thing, but James.
I put his brilliant quote in of the Duke University professor there. If you want to read it out, it's worth reading out. If you go down to the quote bit.
Okay, how far down your piece?
It's just type in Crawshaw and the first time it appears.
Okay.
But he came out with this when he was talking about the hype cycle, about how. There's a comment that Duke University came out with when everybody started talking about big data.
Yeah. Okay. So, and it's funny because he used this analogy at least twice, and I was thinking, James, don't keep bringing this up. People are going to wonder what the fuck is going on here. But he goes, the professor of psychology at university who said big data is like teenage sex. So you can see why we're a bit like, where are you going with this? Everyone talks about it. No one really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it, so everyone pretends they are doing it.
Yeah.
That was
when I included that, Therese was like, "Do we want to keep this in, or are we going to get into trouble?" I was like, "Let's keep it in." I think everybody laughed in the room. So
it's good. And he brought it up again later, and I was like, "James, you might want to step away from the teenage sex analogy."
Yeah.
But no, it is a good analogy. And there's a lot of bluff and a lot of FOMO and a lot of, oh shit, we better be seen to be involved in some way.
All these Rush keynotes, like, we're doing AI, we're doing AI.
And then they did their survey, which almost reinforced that point, that they did a survey of 40 or something, communication service providers, and like every one of them said they were either doing generative AI or looking at it. Yeah, and only one of them said they'd had no interest at all. And it was like, well, it's sort of reinforcing the point that this guy's made. And I don't think, I'm not convinced that it's going to make a huge difference for them in terms of how it can be applied to telco operations. I mean, I'm more than a lot of people probably over the last few years, I've been going on about how AI generally, not general AI, but just all forms of AI could be a way to kind of cut down on your workforce and, get rid of people in certain positions. But the more I think about it, actually, if you're a customer services assistant and someone comes along and starts talking about using a chatbot instead, you've got to be quite careful as an operator before you start getting rid of well-trained human professionals who really know what they're doing and putting a chatbot in its place, because that image is a classic example of what can go wrong.
Somebody last night.
You know, some woman with a third leg. And
yeah, so there's a picture that you got from the slide deck that Omdia provided us where someone had gone to generative AI, let's say ChatGPT, and said, generate a picture of 4 people being interviewed on the beach at Cannes. And it looks really convincing that, you know, there's 4 people, 2 men, 2 women, they got shades on, they're sitting on stools in this beach. It looks plausible. And then there's this one woman who seems to have a third leg, which seems to be a bloke's leg. And then, you know, it's only when you bother to look at it closely, and then it's obvious. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Well, the hands, it doesn't know how to do hands.
Yeah, well, there's one of the blokes looks like he hasn't got a hand either as well. But
I saw a
behind
whole
his back
video
or something. But
that explains why AI doesn't know how to do hands, and it's because the concept of a hand is never just one thing.
I see.
This is a hand, but this is a hand. This is a hand.
Right.
Yeah.
Where a face is always.
And there's a hand holding stuff, and there's
and AI doesn't know. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I sort of cling to, and I think we were chatting after the event. We were chatting with Simon Paul, to shout out Simon, who we've known for years. I first knew him when he was doing PR at Nokia, and he's since been at Vodafone. He's now with the GSMA.
Good writer, Simon Poulter, by the way.
Right.
All music stuff. I read his
Yeah,
blog
he
sometimes.
does a blog, doesn't he?
He's a really good writer.
Yeah. Well, he was a hack way back.
Yeah, I know
in the
he
day,
was, I
wasn't
know, but his stuff's really good to
Cool.
read.
Oh, well, noted. And yeah, I was hassling him to get someone on from the GSMA to make the case for fair contribution.
Yeah.
So maybe that'll happen in the autumn. And I was just going, I think the more you get AI stuff out there, and let's assume it's not making silly mistakes like giving this woman a third bloke's leg, but people are starting to think, is that real? You know, we're going to use words like real quite a lot. And I think that I'm hoping that will create an even greater demand for what I call authenticity, where that is real.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the reasons, whatever success this pod has had is, I've had this confirmed when I'm talking to people, and obviously there's a bit of a self-selecting thing because people are going to be nice to your face. But the fact that, and like with any pod, they will feel like they're basically listening to us chatting in a pub, which ostensibly we are. Yeah. Especially as we're drinking beer.
Yeah.
And our conversations...
Can't get robots to do that, can you?
Yeah, and our conversations in the pub aren't that different. I mean, there might be some shit that we cover in the pub that we wouldn't put on, we wouldn't broadcast. But yeah, so that's authenticity.
Yeah.
We might be right, we might be wrong, but they will at least feel that over the hour or two they listen to us, that they're getting our honest, unfiltered, unpolitical take on what it is. And you might agree, disagree.
The watch analogy, quartz came along, but people still really love to get a mechanical, old-fashioned watch.
Like I've never been tempted to buy like an Apple Watch.
No, you're even going further, but you see what I mean? Like,
yeah.
But I think
there is that.
They had a guy on from the European Broadcasting Union who sort of mumbled through his session on stage in a way that made it quite hard to tell a lot of what he was saying. But he did say they'd come up with this
as well,
chat radio GPT, which is basically
by the way, let me just interrupt because he got in touch with me directly, introduced by Maria and other of the Omdia people, and it wasn't, the thing he was talking about wasn't actually that radio GPT, but it's very similar. But I might as well correct the record because I've done it in my story.
Oh, well, I've got that wrong as well then.
Well, but it's the same concept. It's the same concept. Carry on with what you're saying, but I've just...
Well, I was under the impression that the radio GPT was something that had come out of the EBU itself, and maybe it wasn't. But
so let me just correct it. He was something called Color 3 or 3, maybe. Oh no, I think it's Swiss. But it's the same concept. Carry on. It's not the same concept as what you're going to talk about.
It's like an AI-generated radio station with like AI voices replacing actual DJs, basically, and that sort of thing. And I was thinking, I remember they exposed us to a bit of this horror show at the actual event, and I was thinking, who the fuck would ever listen to this? Why would you want to?
Well, and there's so much content made by human beings.
People listen to radio shows and listen to podcasts or read books because they like to engage with other people and their views and feelings. And opinions about things.
Well, that's the authenticity
I went
thing.
out and climbed a mountain this weekend. Oh, what the hell was that like? What do you think about the match result? Who's ever going to ask an AI what it thought about the match result of the weekend?
Totally.
Well, it might do it first. You might do it first in the way that everybody used to ask Siri stupid questions, and then they were like bored by it because it's just a machine.
But I think what you get, you're completely right. As a consumer, I can't see the appeal. As a way of like creating a revenue stream. So let's say all you got to do is get a license from whichever platform does this stuff, like this Color 3 or the one that I mistakenly thought he was referring to, Radio GPT.
Well, I thought that as well.
Yeah.
He obviously didn't describe it very well on stage.
Well, there we go.
But that's not surprising. He mumbled through most of his on-stage stuff.
All right, let it go.
Some robust feedback for you there, Jonathan.
Get a better speaker on next time from the EBU.
What was I going to say? But then if it only costs you like a 50 quid a month license fee to create this radio station and you get some advertisers to the tune of 100 quid a month, then that's a fucking license to print money because you don't have to do anything. So I can completely
I don't
see
think they'll ever make any money out of things like that.
Well, my gut feel is to agree with you, but what I'm saying is to look at both sides of it. I can see why it might a fully automated thing might appeal as just a pure, easy revenue generator. But you're right, as a consumer, I can't imagine.
It's the same as the area that Pierre's in, like video generated content. You already see bits of it at the moment, and it's never very good. And they're never. It's back to the sort of Einstein, Jimi Hendrix thing. They're never going to come up with some big breakthrough that some director's done. Oh, this is the first time, like Spielberg's, like we've never seen this done before in film, and Spielberg had this innovation that he's done. Generative AI won't do that because everything it does is based on what humans have already done before.
Yeah.
It's based on scraping what has happened. So it won't ever do that. So it's just...
Yeah, but okay, you could argue that everything that Spielberg did was based on his inspirations.
Yeah,
Same
sure.
thing,
but he's still...
also based on humans.
But that's the amazing thing about human intelligence, isn't it? That even though people obviously their whole their brains are based on their experiences in life, they can make those great leaps. Someone can come up with E equals MC squared.
So it's that inspiration part. So you're right, Pierre.
Nothing comes out of thin air.
Yeah, we're a product of our input, but then we've got that little X factor, that je ne sais quoi. That allows us to add that extra bit of value that to Ian's point that certainly in its current form and for the foreseeable future generative AI couldn't do.
The other thing I think that's a worry for the operators sort of getting into it in a big way, which is more on the kind of techie operational side of things, is, and you mentioned this, like these large language models and the resources you need to train them and everything, is you can either do it a couple of ways. You can go off and buy chips directly from NVIDIA and hire a load of AI experts and start trying to develop your own large language models, maybe using some open source technology, and you can train them up in your own data centers. Or you can go to an AWS and a Microsoft Azure, who are trying to pitch this very heavily to telcos at the moment. They've both come up with offerings this year. Like, your first option for doing it is going to cost you a huge amount and probably isn't going to work out, because that's an example of telco diversification, really, even though there's probably not a revenue stream in it. And your second one implies an even closer relationship with big tech than they already have. And one of the concerns for the telcos at the moment is about being overly reliant on a few big suppliers. And they're all a lot of them are very nervous about going with the public cloud, and how do we do that without, imagine having some, basing some of your operations, you feed your manuals into this GitHub Copilot thing that then can write software programs, but it's all supplied really through a relationship with Microsoft. And then something goes wrong. And that
touched me on to, so I'm moving along slightly just because of time. It touched me on to some other good points I thought the Omdia analysts made. Camille Mendler, who did the final presentation, just made a point about how certainly for the foreseeable future, the main role of AI will be more to, this is paraphrasing, she didn't say this, but it's more to solve first world problems. Just like little labour saving bits, little bits of streamlining, just making life a little bit easier, just very simple repetitive tasks being done for you so you don't have to. The ideal being, back to the old Luddite thing of the robots are going to take over and we'll all have to just sit there staring at a fucking wall because there won't be any jobs left. The ideal is that our time is then freed up to do higher things. As per the conversation we were just having, things that uniquely still only people can do. Whether that happens in practice, remains to be seen. But I thought that was a point well made. But before we move on for it, also just want to dip into the more apocalyptic side because it's fun. And there was another analyst, Eden Zoller, who was a little bit more sort of cautious and a little bit more, we better fucking keep an eye on this stuff. Again, I'm paraphrasing her.
Yeah.
Because they're far too professional to say things like that on stage. But she was right as well. And she was just making points about, there was some talk about...
ethics.
Ethics, and also it's like outcomes and optimizing outcomes. And I thought that started to get a little bit sketchy because they were talking about, I think there was one search where if you do a search on ChatGPT or one of these for a job function, it was just all like white blokes coming up.
The trouble I thought with her presentation, and she's obviously a very smart woman and knows this stuff really well, but she seems to have bought into the idea too much that this is actually something that's intelligent to the extent where she's actually talking about it like it's a person. And this idea that you can have racist or biased AI. AI can't be racist or biased or bigoted because all it is based on what people have done.
I didn't totally see it the same way as you. I think she was saying the outputs can be biased.
Yeah.
And then we were getting into the how do you optimize those outputs? Because you could have just pure censorship where you just decide, you just go for the kind of quota thing where, any output that doesn't fit into this ideological template gets rejected, which I think is a very fucking bad idea. And that's where you can get into real totalitarian, scary stuff. But then I think she was also speaking about it at the input phase. Like James pointed out that 60% of ChatGPT is got from this thing called common. No, well, Wikipedia was only about single-figure percentages.
Was it?
60% was this thing called Common Crawl, which I'd never heard of.
Right.
But I linked to him in my piece.
It's just the whole of the internet, though.
Yeah, I mean, if you link on the hyperlink on my piece, it goes, we build and maintain an open repository of web crawl data that can be accessed and analysed by anyone. So, so there's all these special tools which, if you hadn't bothered to look into it like James did, you would never have heard of. But they're saying that it's that old database paradigm of rubbish in, rubbish out. So do you try and affect these things at the input level, which seems better, but even that could be ideological. Like, do you only accept inputs that are ideologically correct? So that all gets very fucking sort of dystopian. But I still thought as a point well made. There was another thing. I think James as well mentioned that open models. So I think this was another point that Eden made about these inputs is stuff like OpenAI. OpenAI is not open at all.
Yeah.
In fact, no one's really got much of a clue.
Source.
Yeah, it's certainly not open source, but a lot of
if things call themselves open.
Yeah, you got to ask the questions. Whereas Meta with its Llama, I think is open source, and I actually think, with my superficial understanding of this stuff, that addresses quite a lot of the dystopian concerns. Because if it is open source and you can see where it's getting all its inputs from, how it's processing them, then you've got that full transparency for tweaking it and optimizing it. But hopefully, and the other thing that's really appealing about open source is it doesn't concentrate power in too many hands. Like if you just had one regulator, some Ministry of Truth, that would be terrible, wouldn't it?
The other thing, I'm not a software programmer. And I've, my exposure to coding, it goes back to my days of trying to write stuff for the ZX Spectrum.
Yeah.
So, or doing a bit
from
of
those
HTML
magazines
these days. But I didn't get the point that she came out with of the algorithms themselves can be biased. I don't see how. So, if generative AI, all it's doing really is scraping the internet. Whether it's Common Crawl or going through Wikipedia or whatever it's going through, it's basically basing its information that it gets from us and what we splurge online. Yeah. Where there's always bias and there's always racism because those things exist in the real world because we're people and they'll always exist. I don't see how any algorithm,
no one's not biased.
Unless you deliberately try and fiddle with the algorithm to start saying, don't take account of things like this, don't take account of things like that.
But then that's introducing
in
bias.
Itself, that's bias.
Then you've got that whack-a-mole thing.
Yeah, so I didn't really understand her point on that at all, I'm afraid.
I mean, no, fair point. I mean, I didn't agree with everything she said, but more broadly, I think that the concerns that she brought up were valid. I didn't necessarily agree with some of her proposed solutions, but the concerns were valid. I think, yeah, and then you get into, so there was this thing I was reading on The Spectator when I was getting the train in now.
But just to that point quickly before you do the Spectator thing, because the other thing is if AI is supposed to be a representation of what we do, and it's trying to be a bit like people, if you make it so that it tries to flush out any kind of bias at all, then you're actually making it not really like like.
And I've got a question back for you. So you say, what if the question you pose the AI has bias built into it, like who's the best telecoms journalist in the world? I mean, we know what the answer to that is, but let's say it got it wrong and said you instead. But what my point is, if you're asking it to make, if the question is asking for it to use its judgment and make a qualitative assessment, then there's bias there. So the algorithm has to be clever enough to.
Well, they seem to be unhappy when they asked it to generate photos of people doing certain jobs, and it showed a bunch of blokes or a bunch of white blokes, and that there were no women or doctors. Now, there are two things I'd say about that. First of all, if you asked it to produce a picture of airline pilots, let's say, and it produced a picture of white men who were sort of in their 50s, they probably have said the same thing. But that's a profession that's dominated by white men in their 50s.
Yeah, well, I mean, Europe. So, I mean, if they were African pilots, presumably not, but yeah.
Yeah, but okay, but let's say you're doing something country specific. That I suspect that people would still be unhappy if it just showed a bunch of white men. I mean, and so maybe what AI generates is just representative of what's going on.
Yeah, so your complaint is with reality. So
your complaint is with reality. It's like when the BBC does these adverts when they've got like someone from every single ethnic background possible and someone with a rainbow flag tied around their head, and it's like, well, it ticks all the boxes, but it's probably not very realistic.
Well, and we haven't got the time to go off on this tangent, but the complaint with reality thing is interesting. Like when we talk about, like Americans talk about affirmative action or positive discrimination. And I've had these debates, for example, with our friend Mary Clark, who is in favour to some degree of some positive discrimination in favour of women in certain workplaces because they're massively underrepresented. And my gut feel is always to push back, because any time you're putting your thumb on the scales, it just jars with me. And also, I think sometimes positive discrimination doesn't even help the people it claims to be helping, because then they've got this cloud of, are they there by merit or is it tokenism type of thing? But Mary's made some very convincing points that sometimes you've got to kickstart these things. And if we've got centuries of overt bias, typically in favour of white men, in certain environments, do you need someone like Rosa Parks or Emmeline Pankhurst or Martin Luther King or whatever, someone to sort of interrupt all that, or Nelson Mandela, these kinds of inflection points.
I think you need them for sure. Of course you do, but you don't. What you don't need is quotas.
But maybe you need structural. So I'm personifying it, but maybe you need structural inflection. But anyway, I'm just saying I'm open to both of those things.
Well, yeah, for sure. But to have they all got upset by some image of like when they said nurses, they're all women. Yeah, and it was like, well. Yes, but most nurses are women. So do you want AI to throw up a picture of a bunch of blokes just to keep you happy on diversity terms?
Well, quite.
Or do you want it to throw up a picture of what the world looks like? And I'm not sure that really classes as bias anyway. It's just a representation of where things are.
And I'm, you're largely preaching to the choir with me when it comes to sort of ideological manipulation of any form. I'm instinctively hostile to it. I just thought I'd nuance it with that. Let me just talk about this one last thing from the Spectator, and then we'll quickly move on because we only got about 15 minutes left.
That's good because I need the loo.
Right, okay.
Just to share that with the audience.
So this is this is actually a transcript of a video they did where someone called James Phillips, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister for Science and Technology and lead author of a report on artificial intelligence, talking to someone called Eliezer Yudkowsky, who's head of research at Machine Intelligence Research Institute. Now, one thing should be stressed, it's quite clear that this Eliezer is bearish on AI. He's like proper Terminator.
Oh, he thinks he's going to kill us all kind of person. Yeah.
So that's there. And so you have to take that with the appropriate pinch of salt.
He's the author.
He's just someone being interviewed.
Oh.
Here, and I've just lost my
And what
place.
are his credentials?
He is now I'm going to have to start my search again. He's head of research at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute.
Oh, He sounds like he'd be well into it.
Yeah, well, you would, but I
sounds
think,
like
but you get these people like you had that guy Geoffrey Hinton suddenly resigned from Google, going, "Hold on a sec, I think this is all getting a bit scary."
Right.
And I'm trying to find the quote. The problem is every time I've gone to the top, I've got to try and find the quote again.
I mean, people get while you're looking for that, people get scared by these hallucinations. You know, where that New York Times reporter, I think it was, like probed ChatGPT a few times and asked it about its shadow self. We talked about this before, and it went, I don't want to be an AI anymore. I want to wipe people out, and everybody got really panicky. It's like, oh my god, it's saying things like this. But of course, all it's doing in a situation like that is looking at what people have written about AI and about the dangers of AI.
And this was
not actually
about 20 questions into it.
Exactly. It wasn't any kind of like the AI suddenly woken up and discovered it that wants to, and that's the problem.
You make the point, and it's worth stressing. We're not talking about artificial general intelligence, which is
actual artificial intelligence,
Skynet
really.
type of
that's
shit.
Properly what artificial intelligence is.
Artificial intelligence,
which none of this stuff is. Actually.
I remember Jamie back used to have a real bee in his bonnet.
Well, he was right too. He was, and at the time I didn't really appreciate that with Jamie. He used to get quite wound up about it, but he's totally spot on. None of this stuff's really, even Gen I, it's not really artificial intelligence, you know. And
no, and it's like machine learning, and he was always making that distinction. So they're just talking about whether an AI in future might just decide to kill us all, and all that sort of thing. And what they're really talking about is how can you instill a machine with human value? So this is back to what we were talking about. Part of it is the bias thing, and then part of it is just, you know, how can you give a machine enormous power but also make it benign, and then whatever human values are, and that's a whole different fucking philosophical discussion by itself. And then the interviewer goes, a classic example is Nick Bostrom's paper clips maximizer. You ask it to produce as many paper clips as possible, and pretty soon it's killed everyone and turned the whole world into paper clips. In other words, it's very simple. It's only got one job. So it's just obsessed with that, and everything else, any amount of collateral damage doesn't matter as long as it makes more fucking paper clips. And then the expert says, this is oversimplified for a couple of reasons. One is that you can't make it want paperclips. So now they're talking about want and actually having emotions. Paperclips, it's something it ends up wanting by accident. Problem number two, and this is the real reason I wanted to bring it up because I thought it was interesting, is he says, what kills you isn't going to be an AI that was deployed to a factory. It's going to be a frontier thing in the research lab that probably hasn't been deployed by anyone at all. And you know, I'll just put a pin in that, and I just want a final quote from him just to show how doom-monger he is. He goes, if we go ahead and build a superintelligence that is anything remotely like the current technology and the current social situation where you've got the heads of major AI labs denying that any problem could possibly exist, if we just plunge ahead as we currently are, the probability is 99% that if we keep going in a straight line, we all die. And I just thought, but back to the point about...
So he's not a doom-monger, is he?
No, but back to this point about the frontier thing in the research lab, as soon as I read that, I thought of COVID.
Yeah.
So everyone pretty much accepts now that the lab leak theory is accurate. The only discussion within that is whether or not they were doing biomedical research or biological weapon research. And the mainstream opinion is it's biomedical research.
Yeah.
But either way, it doesn't really matter. That's just a detail. The point is there was this one lab where there were people fucking around and playing God and messing around with the genomes of viruses.
Yeah.
And all it takes is a single virus to escape, and then the whole world gets shut down.
I think his comments are opportunistic.
Right.
I mean, the point he's made is not different. You could have made the same point 40 years ago when people were talking about AI. Oh, someone could come up with something that, you know, films like Terminator were made based on that premise. Yeah. It's still science fiction. Gen AI is not that thing that he's talking about.
No.
I mean, by the way,
I'm not reading it out because I agree with him.
Yeah, I'm worried about Gen AI because I do think if you put it in charge of something, like someone might, it could fuck things up. You know, you could use it to replace a customer services department, which people probably will try to do, or it could go even further than that, where people put it in charge of critical systems, and then some accident happens because it's just basically doing things based on its prompts, and it all goes wrong. But the sort of vision of it generating robots and stuff, and having thoughts and feelings and deciding people need to be wiped out is. You could have said that 40 years ago. He's jumped on the bandwagon because everybody's talking about it now and come out with those comments.
No, you're probably right. Actually, before I move it on, I'm really going to go on to the last segment very briefly. But I should talk about another Omdia thing that I wrote up today, which is not explicitly about AI. This is to do with how telco customers want to interact with their providers. And anyway, the long and short of it is that their research, and they spoke to about 3,000 people, is that people still really want to deal with other human beings. So that's just another little anecdotal thing to throw into the mix.
Yeah.
I remember a little while back, I was chatting to my mate who you both met, Gavril, and he'd had an interaction with what he thought was a human being. And I said, mate, that sounds like a bot to me. And he's like, fuck off. And, everything about it said bot to me, but perhaps I was more attuned to it because of my day job, and I sort of think about these things. Whereas he genuinely believed that he'd just been dealing with a slightly weird human being.
Well, but people will.
And he's got a nerve calling anyone weird. But then you can have some nasty surprises because it can hurt your ego.
Yeah.
Let's say you get into an emotional exchange, you get pissed off, you think you're having an argument. It turns out you're having an argument with a goddamn ZX Spectrum.
Yeah.
I mean, that hurts your ego, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So anyway,
and that's why people will reject it when it comes to customer service.
There will definitely be a threshold.
Yeah.
There'll definitely be a threshold.
It's like, what the hell? Why have you inflicted this computer program on me when I actually want to talk to a person about my problem and have some sympathy for what I'm going through?
Because you feel insulted, don't you? You can't be bothered to put a human being in.
One of the whole reasons for talking to customer services is that you want that person to empathise with what you're going through. I've had this horrible situation in my house recently. You guys have not done anything about it. How would you feel if that was you? That's
and the
whole
computer's
point.
just going there.
Yeah. So, and that's why it actually it's a terrible idea
answer number
to
3.
replace customer service jobs with it.
So just one last little news item, which I obviously imagined that we might talk about the dystopian angle, and this is something that again seems benign but could have a dystopian thing, which was the
one thing I fail to see is the utopian angle. I have to say. I mean, maybe
the
it's just
utopian angle
I'm a curmudgeon and a miserable git.
Well, the utopian might be slightly overstating it, but as Camille and a few other people said, the utopian angle is that a lot more drudgery. Just like now, 100 years ago, I
don't agree with her on that, though.
Well, hold on, let me just finish. 100 years ago, a typical person running the house, which would typically be a woman, would have spent all her time washing clothes, cleaning the house, preparing food.
Yeah.
And now with machines,
Whereas now it's me that does that.
Although to be fair, we still spend a lot of time. But you can at least get a lot more domestic drudgery done with the help of machines.
With the help of men.
In less time. Yeah, all right, put the fucking violin away. And I think that's what they're talking. I mean, I think it was James who stressed they're just tools.
Yeah.
They don't replace humans, they're just tools. And this is just the next level of tool. And if it takes another level of first world problems away, another level of drudgery, that shit that we don't have to do, that we can farm off to the AI, but it's fairly repetitive and sort of redundant stuff, then that's the utopian
But
vision.
that only works if there are other things for people to do.
Yeah.
If you chomp into the human workforce and you say, let's take away these tasks, you don't have to do that, you don't have to do that, you don't have to do that, oh, there's another thing you don't have to do, then at some point you've run out of things to do and that's new things get created.
Totally.
And that's the problem with
so
complaining about people like, some of the jobs she complained about that weren't very nice, I actually didn't see what the issue was with some of them. I think a couple of them were things that I might have done when I was like a teenager, like some factory stuff. It's like if people want to earn a living, they're going to have to make some money somehow.
Look, now, back when people were a teenager, now they can be an influencer, for example.
Oh, influencers.
That wasn't a thing before?
No, you're totally right. There are new things that get... And I like one of my son's best friends is known as an influencer and makes a lot of money out of YouTube-like stuff. So,
and just more broadly, conceptually, the point Camille made is higher stuff. She didn't specify what that higher stuff might be, and maybe that higher stuff doesn't exist. But if you think about... I think we're quite lucky. One of the reasons I like my job is I feel like I use my brain quite a lot in my job. Whereas I think a lot of people in their jobs probably don't. They feel their brains are probably underused.
Some people don't like using their brains.
Well, there's that as well. But let's say you're someone who does want to use their brain and your job, for whatever reason right now, doesn't really ask it of you. The utopian vision is that with all the stuff that you're currently having to do that's repetitive and boring, you don't have to do that anymore, and then people can get you to do more conceptual human stuff. But that might be bollocks.
But there are I don't want to, there are large parts of the workforce that wouldn't be lawyers or doctors, and ever in any
well, lawyers is one of the professions that's really under threat from AI.
Yeah,
there's a hell of a lot of that stuff.
All right, so if we're going to start losing the cognitive jobs and the ones that require sort of some thought process behind them, but
a lot of lawyering is like hitting the books, and that's the stuff that can be automated.
It has.
I mean, you couldn't create an automated barrister, but you could create an automated going through legal precedent.
I mean,
machine.
one of the strange things I thought about some of the examples she gave, which I think one was working in Printworks,
Right.
is that actually those jobs are harder to automate than the one that you just mentioned, being a barrister or being a
But
being
wasn't there a point that
legal
job's
expert.
already automated?
What is?
I mean, you just don't have Printworks anymore.
You don't have Printworks, because some of it's been replaced with like Apple Mac technology, and people doing things that way. But I'll give you another one then: toilet cleaners or something.
Right. Well, you certainly are always going to need
Things like there are construction jobs and manual jobs that are now looking much harder to replace with AI, I would say. I mean, unless you get some real big advances in robotics, and if you look at the parallel field of what people like Boston Dynamics are doing, who knows, maybe that could go in that direction as well. If that happens, then then you really is everyone going to be an influencer or an AI coder? And apparently the AIs can code as well. So.
Well, that's another thing that comes up is we've got this low code, no code type of stuff. There's people talking about coding being done by the AI, and you just go AI, rate a bit of software that does this, but you're surrendering a hell of a lot of control.
Well, that's what I think. And that's another reason in my story I mentioned that. I don't think that was a conversation last night at the dinner table. I don't want to say who it was with, but this idea that you entrust your software writing to a bit of AI that does it for you, and you don't really have that much oversight of it because you've cut some of your AI team to do and replaced it with your software team.
And then then you can't undo it.
Then you can't
undo it.
Recognize
what it created.
That could be far more damaging than replacing a customer services assistant with a chatbot. So,
so to summarise that, and then I'm going to on that final bit, because we've only got 5 minutes, I'm just going to have a sort of quick monologue. If that's all right with you.
Yeah.
Just because we haven't got time to discuss it. On that final point, what you just said kind of sums it up, and it sums up what I took from that Omdia event, which is, here's all the cool things that can go on, but for fuck's sake, let's not get carried away. And let's be really aware of all the unintended consequences that can come from all this. And I was with that idea. If there's some way in which regulation could intervene, not at a micro level, but at a macro level, to maybe insist that models have to be open source and transparent and visible, then that occurs to me from my completely dilettante, don't really know what the fuck I'm talking about perspective. That might be one of the best ways to keep a lid on this stuff and make sure it doesn't go crazy is the transparency side of it.
Yeah.
On that dystopian note, Nick wrote for our site a headline: German telcos try out EU's digital ID scheme. And so there's digital ID, and we all know the concept of ID, and we all have to use ID, whether it's a driving license or a passport or whatever. And obviously everything's digital now, so it makes sense for ID to be digital. And I think it's quite inefficient, for example, that I have to carry a separate passport. Why can't I have my passport on my phone? I've already got a wallet for my banking on my phone. I can already get tickets to get into Wimbledon or go in Eurostar or whatever on my phone. Why the fuck can't I put my passport there? And we're probably headed there.
Yeah, when you lose your phone, then you're really in trouble.
Well, that is a thing. But then it could all be backed up to the cloud. But then the cloud has got all my sensitive
Then they
shit.
go down.
Yeah. And there's one little quote in the story from Valentina Daiber, Chief Legal and Corporate Affairs Officer at
Diablo.
Telefonica. No, Daiber will be how she pronounced it, assuming she's Spanish. And she goes, whether wallet, banking or mails, every day many people go about their daily lives with their smartphone as a matter of course. It is therefore only logical to add another important facet to life in the digital cosmos with smartphone-based digital identity, blah, 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 blah. And Ursula von der Leyen got involved.
Oh, no, Christ, that can't be a good thing.
It's all an EU thing. Now, so a lot of it makes sense. I extracted that quote because you can't fault her logic, as per what I was just saying about why can't I have my passport on my phone rather than have to have this separate booklet that's so analog, so last millennium. But the flip side of that, it all comes back to like the concentration of power. If you're always quite rightly moaning, and we went to a pub yesterday. I think I mentioned it at the start of the pod, where you went in and it was like, this is a cashless bar. And you're like, so I've got this fucking tenner and I can't give it to you and say, give me that pint of beer in return.
Yeah, even though the government said you're allowed to use this money in venues around the country.
And so, and a grand unified digital ID is another concentration of power. And the problem with it is, it's slightly analogous to the AI thing we were talking about earlier. Who has access? So if now suddenly my whole life is digital, everything about my identity, it's like one of those films, I think there was a Will Smith film where he had his identity stolen or something, and then he just couldn't fucking get anything done.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen that one.
I have.
So, and especially if the digital ID scheme is run by the EU, which is a supranational bureaucracy, and they're all talking in the same way as this AI thing. It'll be great. It'll just smooth everything over. It'll just make it easier for you to do stuff. All you got to do, and presumably you use technologies like Bluetooth and NFC, where you don't even need to get your phone out, and you're just constantly being pulled by.
Just move your crotch towards something.
Yeah, exactly. Just sort of shag some device. But the thing is, you're constantly being assessed and measured and judged by this digital identity. And I don't think you need to be too tinfoil hatty to see that there's not too many jumps from that to a social credit system, as is infamously in place apparently in parts of China.
Yeah.
And as that brilliant Black Mirror episode, I think it's called Downfall or something like that.
Oh, that sounds cheerful.
Yeah, haven't you seen that, Dan? It's
no, I need to watch some of them.
Bryce Dallas Howard.
Oh, I like her.
Yeah, well, and she's brilliant in this. And basically, it's a, I mean, the genius of one of the many geniuses of Black Mirror is it's like contemporary dystopia. It's like now, but a bit different.
Yeah.
And often to do with technology, because I think Charlie Brooker's very into technology. He was a tech hack back in the day. And this is a world where you're just constantly, you've got this score, this algorithm, this like marks out of 10. And just like with social credit, if you've got 10 out of 10, you've got all these freedoms. But if you've only got 5 out of 10, a bunch of shit is denied you. And this brilliant Black Mirror episode sort of extrapolates that and just imagines this particular woman who's obsessed with her digital identity being optimized, it all just going Pete Tong.
And this is in the new series?
No, this is back in the original bunch.
Okay, I'll have to have a look at that.
Anyway, so you can just imagine digital ID. Like there's all this other, we were talking with the AI stuff, we were talking about, and actually I better wrap it up. We were talking about optimizing the output.
Yeah.
Well, with digital ID, they could say, well, they could link it to your carbon footprint, or they could link it to some other extra legal moral framework. And then you could be punished in all sorts of ways. And it basically has the potential to concentrate power in the hands of this sort of big brother type who just says, no, Ian, no freedoms for you today. You've been a bad boy. Anyway, I better wrap it up because we've got to go off to meetings and all that sort of thing. On that cheery note, and so, yes, just remind you again, this is it from us. So enjoy this pod. And obviously download some old ones if you've missed them. And you won't hear from us for a few weeks and only about once over the next about month and a half.
I think in a month, yeah. We're recording in a month.
In a month, but then there'll be another big gap after that.
And then in a month again,
Yeah. So yes, enjoy this, and thanks a lot for watching, and hold on for that one.